We haven't had a proper conservative revolution in this country since the late 70s, early 80s, right? We haven't seen a transformation the like of which we need to see. So we've seen that creep back of the state over the last...
So what does that look like in practice from you as leader, Tom? What does that look like in practice to have that revolution that we need?
So it looks like some pretty big economic changes. Look at the investments that you've got into Teesside, right? You've got some phenomenal investments. You've got a South Korean company that is building wind turbines. You've got that company that's building the net zero turbine with the carbon capture and storage facility offshore. A lot of that money is foreign. Now, that's great, absolutely. And I'm absolutely delighted that you're attracting foreign direct investment. But the truth is, if we're only attracting foreign investment and we're not generating investment of our own, then what we're doing is effectively we are putting ourselves effectively dependent on the kindness of strangers. That's what we're doing. And we need to make sure that we get our own capital markets flowing again. And I talk about live money and dead money. And the reason I talk about live money and dead money is because the truth is, cash, capital, if you like, is the blood that runs through the body. It's what connects generations and geographies. Because cash is nothing more than just the ability to transfer energy and ideas from one area to another. So when I invest in Teesside, all I'm doing is I'm taking the energy and investment from a community like mine in Tunbridge, and I'm putting it into Teesside, hoping that you're going to then make that work, and then that money will flow again, and it'll either flow back to Tunbridge or it might flow somewhere else, right? What we've seen over the last 30 years, for various different reasons, and I'm not blaming any particular government, is we've seen that live money, if you like, that money that's flowing through the system, turned into dead money. What's effectively happened, it's been frozen. And you can see it. You can absolutely see it. So you can see it in the symptoms, right? You can see it in the symptoms that DeepMind could not raise the hundreds of millions of pounds it needed to get to the next stage here in the UK. So they had to be sold to Google.
Why was that?
Well, because they couldn't raise the cash. Now, let me tell you the fundamental of it. The same is true, by the way, of Arm, which was sold to SoftBank, right? Yeah. Those are symptoms. What's the cause? Well, the cause is that very slowly we have regulated more and more and more to take risk out of investment. A perfectly understandable reason. You saw what happened with Equitable Life. You saw what happened with Mirror Group newspapers. You saw what happened with the pensions industry across the UK in the 90s. Increasing amounts of risk. People didn't feel that their savings were safe. So the government started to regulate. And part of that regulation was to remove that early stage risk, that risk over the next 5 to 7 years that people can actually control. And what they did by doing that is effectively they injected massive amounts of long-term risk. Because what they did was they removed the ability of people to invest more into equities, the sort of, the money that starts a business or hires somebody or sees an idea develop. And they had to put it into debt in order for it to be safer. And actually what that's done is effectively it's taken money out of the live economy, the live money, and it's put it into the dead economy, the bricks and the government debt. And that is a net harm to society. Now, just look at the comparisons. If you are a pension fund in Australia, about 20% of your money, that's about 18 actually, but about 20% of your money is in debt, about 80% is in equities and hiring people. The same is true in Canada, similar in America. What is it in the UK? 60% in debt. 3 times as much of your money has effectively been frozen and isn't free to hire people. So what does that mean? Well, it means that you don't have the cash. You don't have the cash to start the business. You don't have or more importantly, actually, you don't have the cash to take your business from that early stage of being you and a couple of other people in a garage to actually becoming a business that's growing, that's developing, that's hiring more people and innovating. And that's a real problem. That's a fundamental problem with the economy.
It is. It's something, interestingly, that's been coming up time and time again more recently about this kind of broken view of modern capitalism, particularly within the UK.
But it's not broken. It's overregulated. It's broken because we have effectively we've frozen it, and that's the mistake we've made. We've made the mistake that governments often make. They try to eliminate risk, but you can't eliminate risk. There's no way of eliminating risk.
Well, it's built into the model of capitalist market, right?
Well, it's just built into life, I'm afraid. Ben. I mean, it's just true, right? I mean, and let's be honest. Risk is like energy; it can be neither created nor destroyed. All you can do is transfer it.
Absolutely.
And the truth is, what we've done is we have, because governments like to control the things they can control, we have regulated out risk over the term of a government that it can foresee, 5 to 7 years. And of course, all that means is, you've lowered the short-term risk, but you've massively increased the long-term risk. Look at pensioners. Pensioners are getting a return, because it's largely based on debt, of, in the low single digits, 2 to 5% returns over their pensions, not the 12% returns that you'd get if you were in Canada or Australia or America. Now, that's costing the pensioner. That is a huge cost on the pensioner. What's the compound interest of 5% a year? I mean, it's a huge amount of money that's being taken away from pensioners.
These changes that you're talking about bringing in, and you would look to bring in to deregulate, in effect, some of these markets. We might have some people listening to the Blueprint podcast that have stumbled this way and are not necessarily of this type of conversation. How does that help Mr. or Mrs. Smith in Teesside or Humberside or Liverpool? And how do those changes affect them? Who they're not going to directly start up their own business, maybe some of their children or grandchildren might.
But look, let's look at it. So I started off by talking about the symptoms, right? The symptoms are that Google has bought DeepMind or that SoftBank has bought Arm. What are the consequences of that? Well, the consequences are that when you see the next level of development, where does it go? Well, it doesn't go to the UK, does it? It goes
back to headquarters.
It goes back to headquarters, exactly right. And the same is true when you see decisions being made on things like water or investments in rail or energy. You find yourself having to go abroad for that money because you don't have the cash in the UK. So instead of being able to borrow off British pensioners, borrow in the equity sense, as it were,
absolutely.
Have that stake in the investment in the building the future. Instead of having that shared belief over 100 years, what you do is you go to foreigners, and really good foreigners like Australians. I mean, nothing wrong with Australian money, nothing wrong with Canadian money, but they automatically have to have a shorter term time horizon. Of course they do, because they're working for different people, right? They're not working for your pensioners, they're working for pensioners in Australia. So they've got to think about currency risk, they've got to think about geographical and geopolitical risk, they've got to think about changes in the regulatory environment in their own country, which won't be linked to the questions about the long-term investment in that infrastructure, but simply based on their own domestic considerations. So what that does is it massively reduces the time horizon. It means that instead of being invested for 100 years, like we did with the Victorians, right? When we built train lines, they knew they were investing for 100 years. People are investing for, at most, 10, maybe 20 years. And that really changes things. It means that, our water companies have to focus on paying out dividends rather than investing in the long term. It means that our water companies, our train lines don't have the long-term investment that makes a difference. And they have to pay more, effectively, for capital than they would otherwise. And it means that we find ourselves in a world where we are not investing enough in the infrastructure that our country needs to develop.
I think you've hit on something. I think one of the things, you can see the politics of this, right? People will try and characterise this as, taking more risk with people's pensions and, casino banking is back and all that kind of stuff. Whereas actually, I think as the UK, we've become slightly too navel-gazing and parochial in the way that we look at these things. I think the Australians, the super-rands in Canada are great examples. They're incredible, right? They're investing all over the world. They're making loads of money.
Yeah.
And actually,
they're effectively sovereign wealth funds.
Absolutely. And they're creating huge returns for their pensioners.
Yeah.
And if we could, I think you're absolutely right. I think you've hit on something here, Tom, that we need to move that narrative and the dial to have these more global conversations about other models in the world that work. Because the one, like I say, I think there is an increasing narrative locally that the model that we currently have isn't working. So this is the conservative way of being able to bring back that wealth.
But this is exactly right. And this is conservative because, frankly, it's building on some very, very fundamental truths. When people are saving for their pension, do they really think that they're burying it in the ground to dig up in 30 years' time? No, they don't. They think that they think that they're using that money to help people start businesses, to see employment, to see growth, because they want their kids and their grandchildren to have the chance,
and ultimately that their investment itself will grow.
Exactly right. And because the truth is, whether you're invested in the state, if your pension is in the state, or whether it's in the private sector, it doesn't matter. The reality is you are fundamentally invested in the ability of young people coming after you to grow the economy, to either pay the taxes or to buy the goods that you're invested in. That's what you're invested in. And so if you don't get that growth, what you end up doing is you end up in the position where we are now, where effectively the state is growing at about 2% because low-skilled migration has boosted national GDP, but at the same time wage GDP, the individual opportunity for individuals to grow their own personal economy, has basically flatlined. Now that is a series of decisions we've taken based on constraint, based on avoidance of risk based on effectively a bureaucratisation of the British industry that I think is net harmful. Now, as I say, when I look at what you've done, this isn't a question of private good and state bad. This is a question of partnership, and at the moment we've got that partnership out of whack.